I'm not going to ruin it. I'm not going to give you spoilers, but, well, maybe I will.
Where did gold fail where Bitcoin will succeed?
Bitcoin has the lowest supply growth rate, so it's even better than gold at being like gold. I think the Austrian school is doing a lot better, and I think it is because of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a living refutation of a lot of the main ideas in mainstream economics and an advertisement for a lot of the ideas of Austrian economics. And that is a theme, an important theme in my Gold Standard book. People will think that I may have brought about the death of fiat.
Hell yeah. Yeah, welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. We're here in the beautiful Lugano, Switzerland, and I'm joined with a man who needs no introduction, Saifedean Ammous. How you doing, man?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.
Saif, I'm going to start the interview with this. You know, you wrote, I think, one of the most consequential books that I think is going to be known for, the next century, multiple centuries, most consequential economics books. And I think, the market is saying that, is signaling that. Did you know that the Bitcoin Standard was going to be as influential as it was when you wrote it?
No, obviously not. I did not expect it to be this way. I was writing it. It was the right thing for me to do at that point in time to write it, because I was spending all my days arguing with people on the internet about Bitcoin. And one day my wife walks into the house and just looks at this gigantic essay that I was typing as a response to some comment on Facebook. There's a friend about Bitcoin, and she just said, "My God, I can't believe how much time you're wasting commenting on Facebook. You could have written a book if you had spent all of that time." And I remember just looking at her and thinking, wow, she's actually right. You know what? No more Facebook comments. I'm going to just actually write a book. And it was just all of these ideas that I had in my mind that I had to go on into one place so that I don't have to repeat myself every Facebook thread. So yeah, definitely there was no conception that this was just going to be as big as it became, but obviously I'm happy it has.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's changed the world. And, it's really interesting to me, and perhaps it's like a metaphor of some sorts, that the Fiat Standard is actually thicker than the Bitcoin Standard, which I think is a great representation of trying to explain the complexities of an inferior system.
Absolutely.
Was that on purpose, or it just required more text?
No, it wasn't on purpose. It was just, after I wrote the Bitcoin Standard, I thought there were some loose ends in the book, some issues that needed to be addressed, some questions that I hadn't gotten to. And with the Bitcoin Standard, I had a strict word limit from my publisher. And then I decided, all right, the best way to do it would be to talk about the fiat system and then discuss the main questions that were left loose from the Bitcoin Standard, which is how Bitcoin can rise in a world of fiat money. And so to do that, I decided I'm going to start trying to explain fiat in the same way that I explained Bitcoin, thinking of fiat as just another digital currency, which it ultimately is, because only less than 10% of fiat money is usually printed in physical form. The rest and the vast majority is digital. So if this was a digital currency, how would you describe it to somebody who has never understood or looked at how it works? And I realized it's actually quite more complicated than Bitcoin. People just use it. They don't quite understand how it works, but it's an extremely elaborate and contrived mechanism. It's a weird contraction that operates in a quite weird ways.
Does it surprise you? Of course it doesn't surprise you, because you wrote in all these books, but I think being a Bitcoiner, you've come to the realization that money plays an integral role in society. And there are a lot of outcomes that come from people using broken money. So could you describe, because you do a deep dive into a lot of this, the moral implications, the family implications, the short-term thinking, the long-term thinking, my personal favorite, the food, right?
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is completely misunderstood, perhaps not misunderstood, but underappreciated.
Obscure. People don't think about it.
Don't understand how important a role money plays in society.
No, I agree. And I think, I think a big part of the success of my books was precisely because of this, because once people see this, they start seeing it in all manner of decisions. So I've gotten so many emails and messages from people who tell me about how they see this pattern of fiat in all manner of aspects of life and business and society and so on. If I were to try and summarize it, and obviously it's a sophisticated idea that has been fleshed out over three books and my coming fourth book, I'd say that ultimately money is like a a control knob for our time preference. And time preference refers to the degree to which we discount the future. So all human beings discount the future compared to the present. If I were to offer you something today or that same exact thing 1 year from now, you will almost certainly say that you would prefer it now. And it's a rational thing to do because you might not be here in a year, you might not be here to enjoy it, and you'd rather have it now rather than in the future. The future is uncertain ultimately. There's no guarantee that you're going to be here in the future. So people always prefer the present, and that's normal and natural. However, the less uncertain the future becomes, the more you're able to provide for the future, the more you're able to see the future with certainty, then the less you discount it, the more you start thinking about it, the more you care about it. And I think that as humans, human civilization develops as a result of our lowering of our time preference. We start discounting the future less and less, so we start providing for the future more and more, and we start behaving in ways that are conducive to our future well-being at the expense of the present. In other words, we start curbing our inner instincts. So you get angry at somebody, you are not happy with somebody, you don't just kill them. You think you don't want to be a murderer, you don't want to have the consequences of having murder on your conscience, you don't want his family to come and avenge you, you don't want to go to jail. You start thinking about the long-term consequences of things. So you curb your animalistic instincts and you become future-oriented. So you can see human civilization is just this process of lowering time preference, and that's not original to me. I quote Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe, who came up with that formulation. We lower our time preference as we build civilization. So people start investing in the long term. We don't just have random children with random strangers and leave them on the street. We build families, so we take care of our children, and the idea is that if you take care of your children in your old age, they'll take care of you. And then culture, society, religion, they all work when they work properly. They work to lower people's time preference, to make people think more and more about the future. But the technology that I think is the most pivotal toward lowering our time preference is money, because money is the most reliable way of providing for the future. You take resources from today, you put them in the form of money, you sell them, and you acquire money in exchange. And you hold that money for the future, and lo and behold, in the future, you've got resources available to you just because you've held on to the money. So as civilization advances, as our time preference declines, we're constantly finding better forms of money to provide for the future. And the better our money is for providing for the future, the better it holds value that you store in it into the future, the more certain your future becomes, the less uncertain the future becomes. And so therefore, the more you start thinking of the future. And so you can see human civilization as being intertwined with the increasing hardness of our money, the difficulty of producing our money, which makes our ability to provide for the future more effective. So as civilization advances, we move toward harder and harder monies, and our monies keep getting harder to make, because the harder the money is to make, the less it is likely that others will produce from it, and therefore the less they will devalue the value you store in it. So as money gets harder, we become more civilized, more future-oriented, more peaceful, and more likely to engage in productive, cooperative behavior rather than destructive conflict. And I think the human species essentially took a radical turn for the worst in this aspect with the move from gold to fiat money in the beginning of the 20th century, because that compromised our money's ability for providing for the future. And so therefore, it became harder for you to provide for your future self, and so therefore you discount the future more heavily. Gold's supply increases at around 1.5% to 2% per year, but fiat money supply increases at around 14% per year is the average over the last 60 years. So it's almost 10 times as much annual inflation. So therefore, you would expect fiat money has effectively been terrible at holding on to its value. And so therefore, it's taken away from people the ability to easily save for the future. Providing for your future self is not something very easy. And so in the Bitcoin Standard and in the Fiat Standard, I fleshed this out in detail. What are the implications of this? And it's astonishing how powerful this is as a way of explaining a lot of the things that we see in the world. So when people move toward having a higher time preference, they become more present-oriented. So they're more likely to spend the resources that they have today rather than save them in the future, right? And it makes sense. Look at a place that has hyperinflation. People get their paycheck today. They run to the supermarket right after they get their paycheck to go and spend that paycheck and try and acquire as much resources as they can, because it makes no sense to hold on to the rest of to any of your paycheck until the end of the month, let alone hold on to it for a year or 5 years or 10 years from now. So that's what happens in hyperinflation. But when you have steady low inflation, which is the situation that you get in most of the world, then you're just seeing the same thing, but to a lesser extent. So people aren't rushing to the supermarket to spend all of their money on the first day that they earn it, but they are discounting the future a lot more. They're saving less of their money for their future self in 5 or 10 years' time, because there's little reliable methods. There are few reliable methods for providing for yourself in a decade or so. And so you see this reflected in economic decision making, but you also see it reflected all across all aspects of life, because money is pervasive to everything. It's pervasive to every economic transaction that we carry out. And our ability to provide for ourselves in the future governs how we behave in all manners of ways as pertaining to the future. So I think you see this reflected in people's emphasis on family. When you can't save, you're less likely to commit to long-term relationships. You're less likely to want to start a family. And because starting a family is more uncertain, it's hard to save. It's hard to have the resources that you need to comfortably provide for others. So you become more present-oriented. You become more fixated on short-term relationships rather than long-term relationships. You see this in architecture, for instance, in the 19th century under the gold standard.
Yep.
You look around, in this beautiful town here, you see that a lot of the homes, a lot of the most beautiful buildings were built in the 19th century. And this is pretty common everywhere. All the nice areas in the US are 19th century homes, 19th century buildings. And they're still alive, 150 years later, because during that time, the money you had lasted long. And so you had a long-term horizon. You thought about things for a long time. The money that you held would appreciate over 50 years. So if you were going to spend that money on building a house, you wanted that house to also be there in 50 years. Now, in a world in which the money loses half of its value in 5 years' time, which is what happens at 14% supply growth rate, you'd expect it to lose approximately half of its value in 5 years' time. Then you don't need to have a house that's going to last you 50 years. You can build something that will be essentially disposable. And so you see this around. You see houses that are being built today. They get torn down in 20, 30, 40 years, and they get replaced. And so people's ability to make long-term investments is compromised, and you see this reflected everywhere. And I think you also see it in food. And there's also, I should say, there's also a second aspect to it, or the other side of the coin, is you're losing that purchasing power from your money because your money is being devalued. Well, where is that purchasing power going? There is the other side of the story. The sinister aspect of it is that somebody is
through distribution.
Yeah, it's wealth distribution. Essentially, it's the government and government-connected people and cronies who are benefiting from that inflation. Essentially, what they're doing is they're taking the purchasing power from you. And so that extra purchasing power is reflected in more resources, more power in the hands of the government and in the hands of the people who are in charge of the government. So you are less capable of providing for your future self, but your government has a lot more money to shape the world today. And so that results in more conflict, more war, more spending on things that are not economically sane, but there's little opportunity cost to government spending because government is able to do whatever it wants because it can just devalue everybody's money. And to go back to the issue of food, you see these two combine in a very sinister way. Because on the one hand, people are losing their ability to hold value, so therefore they're becoming more present-oriented and they discount the future more. So when they decide what to eat, they're more likely to make decisions that are destructive to their health. They're more likely to eat things that are not very good for them because they value the kick that you get out of the candy bar now, and they discount the long-term health effects of this thing. But on the other hand, you also, food is one of the most important aspects of everybody's expenditure, or at least for most people. Food is a significant part of their expenditure, and food is something that you buy every day almost. So therefore, you are quite sensitive to what is happening with the prices. So when your money is being devalued, the most effective way, or the most visceral way in which most people feel that devaluation of the money is in the growth in the price of the food items that they purchase. And so therefore, that makes people quite skeptical of their government and the government's policies. So governments aren't very fond of people being angry at their food becoming more expensive. So in the 20th century, particularly after the 1970s, as food became very expensive because of the inflation of fiat money, we see that governments have dedicated an enormous amount of resources to telling people that they should be eating cheap food. And I think this explains all of the scam that is modern nutrition science that's out there telling people.
The pyramid.
Yeah, the pyramid. You need to eat 6 to 10 rations of grain every day, which is essentially a very reliable formula for developing diabetes. But it's also very good for the government because grains are cheap. And so if you replace nutritious, good meat with cheap grains, then you've underreported inflation. Then people's food is not becoming much more expensive. So therefore, inflation is less of a problem. So on the one hand, you have the government is destroying the value of your money. You can no longer afford real food. They're taking those resources and they're telling you, hey, anyways, actually, real food is bad for you. It's bad for the planet. The cows are going to ruin the weather or some shit like that. And what you should be eating instead is essentially industrial waste. If you eat industrial waste like, the seed oils, hydrogenated oils, if you eat cheap grains that have always been fed to animals or slaves, then actually that's healthy for you. And so the result is people's health has been destroyed. People's finances have been destroyed. And it's just a very, very, very terrible story. All based on just the destruction of the value of money, which is something that most economists in the mainstream tradition will tell you is essentially costless. Like it's just 1 or 2 or 3% every year. And with that, we are able to finance the government without any cost. But there's always a cost.
And their argument is basically, without inflation, people wouldn't spend. And don't beat me up, Saifedean. I'm playing devil's advocate. What would be your counter to that?
My counter to that is that it is very obviously false. First of all, we can see it in examples like tech goods, cell phones. Cell phones get cheaper every year. The same cell phone that you are buying today will be a lot cheaper if you wait another year or 5 years for it. And the cell phone that you bought 5 years is a lot cheaper today. So why did you buy it 5 years ago? Why are you buying a cell phone now? And why will you still be buying one in 5 years? Why don't you permanently delay it? And the answer is, again, time preference is positive. You prefer things now over things in the future. You may not make it to the future. You may not survive to the future. You want to consume things now. You want to get married when you're young. You want to have kids when you're young. You want to live in a house now. So people always have an incentive to spend. We consume because we would like to survive. We want to enjoy life. We want to avoid death. We want to avoid destitution. We don't want to be homeless. And so people always have an incentive to spend. We don't need to be incentivized to spend. We want to consume. We want to survive. And so people already have that. We don't consume things just because our money is devaluing. It's true that the devaluation of the money can make us more consumption oriented. And that is true. That's part of the effects of the things that I was mentioning when I was talking about the effect of inflation. It's true. We do spend more, but it isn't as if the money would appreciate that we wouldn't spend anything. People under the gold standard, their money appreciated and they still spent money. So you will always want to spend because you always want to experience the joys of life. You always want to avoid dangers. We don't need any extra motivation by destroying the value of our money. And if we are able to save, and if the money appreciates, we get more capital, we have more savings, we're able to invest in accumulating more capital that increases our productivity, it increases our income and our wealth, and therefore allows us to spend more and more and more. In fact, the richest countries in the world are the countries that have saved the most in the past. I think this is the perfect example. Switzerland has always had some of the highest savings rates in the world. And as you can see, they're not exactly destitute. They are consuming. It's one of the richest places in the world. And it's one of the places where the people have the highest living standard. But that happens precisely because people delay consumption, because they delay gratification.
Yo, I want to tell you about the best place to build your automatic self-custody Bitcoin stack, bitcoinwell.com. What makes Bitcoin Well different? What makes it unique? It's an automatic self-custody Bitcoin on-ramp. What does that mean? That means that when you buy Bitcoin on Bitcoin Well, as soon as the funds clear, it goes straight to your self-custody Bitcoin wallet address, which perfectly aligns with the Simply Bitcoin ethos, because after all, self-custody is the revolution. By the way, If you go to bitcoinwell.com/simply, as soon as you make your first purchase, you get 3 opportunities to win up to 1 million Satoshis just for signing up and buying a little bit of Bitcoin. Seems like a win-win. What are you waiting for? Go to bitcoinwell.com/simply today. Do you need liquidity without having to sell your Bitcoin? For more than 6 years now, Ledn has been the trusted source for Bitcoin-backed lending, with transparency, security, and trust at their core. Backed by $9 billion of Bitcoin loans funded and over 1,000 5-star reviews. I absolutely love these guys because of their flexibility. You can pay back your loan whenever you want. And there are no monthly payments, so you pay at the end of the term. You get lightning fast access to capital. As soon as you send your Bitcoin as collateral, you get the cash into your account within 18 hours. Unlock the liquidity of your Bitcoin without having to sell your Bitcoin. Simply Bitcoin viewers get 0.25% off their first loan by using the link in the video/podcast description. What are you waiting for? Check out Ledn today.
What are the parallels do you see between the gold standard and the Bitcoin standard? And where did gold fail where Bitcoin will succeed?
I think the most important parallel between the two is in the hardness of the production. So gold's supply is always increasing at around 1.5 to 2% per year. And that comes from just the chemistry of gold, the fact that gold is essentially indestructible. And it's a metal that humanity has had for thousands of years. So for thousands of years, humans have been digging for gold, finding gold, refining it, and then it's come onto the market. And all of the gold that we've been accumulating for all of those thousands of years is still out there. You know, the same gold that was worn by Cleopatra may today be in some random lady's earring. It's always just been there, so it's always accumulating. So even though our technology for looking for gold keeps improving, and every year we produce more gold, we find more gold, we're always adding on to a fixed supply that is not dwindling. It's not being consumed. The gold that exists is not being consumed. So therefore, even as our production goes up, our stockpile of gold also goes up. So therefore, there's always this balance where we're constantly only increasing the supply every year by around 1.5 to 2%. And that's held for more than a century now. And so that has given gold the lowest supply growth rate of any metal. And that's why gold was money. That's what I argue it makes gold money, and what the Austrian school in general argues is the key monetary property of gold. The analogy here with Bitcoin is that Bitcoin has an even lower supply growth rate. Starting last year, Bitcoin's supply growth rate dropped below 1.5. It's now around 0.8% per year. So Bitcoin has the lowest supply growth rate, so it's even better than gold at being like gold. That, I think, is the parallel, the similarity. And the difference is that gold is a lot harder and more expensive to move around. It's got great salability across time, but it's not as good as Bitcoin. But it's got not very good salability across space. It's difficult to move gold around. It's expensive. So if you want to pay somebody with gold halfway around the world, you have to either incur an enormously expensive cost, get on a plane or a ship and travel halfway around the world and hand it to them, or you're going to have to rely on financial intermediaries that do this. And that became essentially impractical by the late 19th century, early 20th century, because it meant a massive centralization of gold reserves in central banks across the world. And so as a result of this, you see this increase in government power at the beginning of the 20th century, which culminated with World War I, where central banks essentially suspended the gold standard across the belligerent country.
Which coincidentally, the Federal Reserve was literally, it started in 1913. World War started a couple years later. You think that was a coincidence?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the growth of central banking was happening all over the world, and there were a lot of interests that wanted this to happen. And, whether it had anything to do with the war is an interesting question. I don't know. I don't have any kind of special insight on it, but something that I get into in depth in my next book, The Gold Standard, which is coming out in the next few months.
Let's talk about that. So the Gold Standard, an alternative history story. I'm an alternative history junkie. So I'm really looking forward to that. So could you, give a maybe some sneak peeks or
Yeah,
incentivize the viewers.
Yes.
The book will probably be out by the time this episode comes out. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, it's going to be out November 14. Essentially, the book asks the question, what would the 20th century looked like on a gold standard? So we look at the world of the 20th century. I think one of the most important things to happen in the 20th century was the fact that money was fiat, was government money, and it had a high supply increase rate. And that started after 1914. The world really went off the gold standard in 1914. It returned onto the gold standard, at least nominally, in most countries in the 1920s, but that was not really a return to the gold standard as it was before the war. And then the world practically left the gold standard in the 1930s, and it's never been back since then. And that has, I believe, been devastating. So what I do in the gold standard is I essentially introduce Bitcoin to the world in 1910. And the way that I do it is I imagine so the first third of the book is like history, real world history, the world up until 1915. The second third of the book is fictional, and it's like a novel almost. It's a work of fiction, studying the lives of a few entrepreneurs who essentially changed the world. Analog Satoshi Nakamoto's effectively, and it's a French aviation pioneer named Blériot, who's a real person. He was the first guy to cross the channel between France and Britain, and he was an entrepreneur. He invented the headlight on the car, so he had a lot of money, and he was a huge aviation buff and built some of the first airplanes. So he partners with the Wright brothers in the US. Wow. And they make, and they wanted to make aviation scale. They wanted to make aviation grow. They were inspired by Ford and what he did with the car. They want to do the same thing with the airplane. And they figure out that we need a commercial application of flight. But at that time, flight was very expensive. So moving people around wasn't economical because people weren't going to pay because people are heavy. And moving economic goods around wasn't really economical unless the goods were extremely valuable. So what's the most valuable thing per unit of weight? Gold. So he figures out that the only way that we could make this scale is if we start running a gold clearance service with airplanes across Europe and North America and then the rest of the world. And it's a great idea because it picks up very quickly because people want to have access to quick money because, the world is becoming industrial, and so people are trading across the world. And there was telegraphs and telephones at that point. So the world was globalizing, trade was becoming more and more international. And that company, which is Blériot Transport Corporation, in other words, BTC, that company becomes the essentially central bank replacement. So it picks up, business is great, 1911, 12, 13, 14, then World War I starts. And in the real world, at that point, central banks stop the redemption of gold and they confiscate most of the people's golds. And people had no choice but to hand over their gold because they had nowhere else where they could move the gold unless they go through the central banks. But in this alternative history, they've got those airplanes. So they don't hand in their gold, they keep their gold, they use BTC to clear their payments with the rest of the world. And that essentially then leads to the collapse of central banks in 1915. All of the major governments, their central banks all collapse at the same time. And so the war ends, the French is empty, nobody can pay their soldiers, the soldiers leave. And then Switzerland takes a center stage. Switzerland effectively becomes the world superpower in that novel because all of those people had been taking their gold out of their country, sending it with those airplanes to Switzerland. So all the countries are broke, and Switzerland, they're just civilized, peaceful people. They don't want to be part of a war. They want everybody else to be civilized and peaceful. And so there's a grand conference here in Switzerland where Switzerland invites all the major powers, and they essentially Swissify the world. They impose a Swiss world order in which they tell the world, you've got to have freedom of movement of capital. You've got to allow for the right of self-determination. And it provides a framework that allows the world to end these conflicts. And then we have essentially an incredibly utopian century of peace, prosperity, free trade, and monetary soundness. And then the thought experiment is think about the technological and social impacts of this. How would the 20th century have been different? It's a pretty extensive book. It's similar to the Bitcoin Standard in a sense, but in an alternative universe.
I think it could potentially be a glimpse into the future in a way.
Exactly.
A glimpse into the past that also glimpses into the future of what the possibilities of a sound money standard would be. Now, Saif, have your views evolved at all since you wrote the Bitcoin Standard many years ago?
I mean, obviously, yeah, a lot has happened. I wrote the Bitcoin Standard in 2017. It was published in 2018. So yeah, a lot has happened. But I would say on the key ideas in the book, I think they've held up pretty well.
Absolutely.
And the book is probably selling more this year than it did in its first year. So I think it's because ultimately nothing has really changed in Bitcoin. The fundamentals in Bitcoin are still the same and they're still pretty constant. So these kind of timeless aspects of Bitcoin, they are the ones that I focused on. So I'm happily stubbornly sticking to my guns.
I want to give a shout out to our partner, Sat123.com. Sovereignty isn't just about your money, it's about your communications too. When the grid goes down, most people go dark. Cell towers fail in hurricanes, cyber attacks, and blackouts. But satellite phones, they don't rely on local infrastructure. Iridium has 77 satellites in orbit, giving you a direct line anywhere in the US, even offshore. If you hold your own Bitcoin keys, you should hold your own comms too. Sat123.com also has everything you need to start building your Bitcoin citadel. Starlink, battery backups, Faraday bags to protect your hardware wallets, and much, much more. It's a one-stop shop for anyone serious about resilience and off-grid independence. Stay connected, stay independent, stay sovereign. Go to sat123.com/simply today and use promo code SIMPLY to get 15% off anything on the store.
So we talked about the Bitcoin Standard, we talked about the Fiat Standard, we talked about your upcoming book that's coming out in November, which by the time you guys watch this episode, it should be out for sale. You can find it on your website.
Yes.
What's the website?
Saifedean.com or thesafehouse.com. And you can also find the paperback on Amazon.
Boom, boom, boom. But we haven't talked about your other book, which is The Principles of Economics. Now, what I find really interesting about this book specifically is it adds to the Austrian School of Economics in a way. I think both Mises and Menger, forgive me, I'm not a college professor. I'm a YouTube podcaster, if I mispronounce that. But I feel like the Austrian School of Economics would not be possible. It wouldn't be possible without Bitcoin, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So I think you wrote that book, and it's the way that I interpret it is Austrian economics for the digital age.
I think so. I mean, I wouldn't say that Austrian economics wouldn't be possible without Bitcoin. It's existed for 140 years or so since Menger wrote his book in 1870. But I think what Bitcoin has done is it's given Austrian economics an incredible lease of life. I mean, it's astonishing. Just a couple of hours ago, I was in the Plan B conference, and we had a panel with Knut Svanholm and Rahim Tagizadeh, and the discussion of the panel was the history of the Austrian school, and it was packed. The room was packed, a couple of hundred people standing. A lot of people couldn't come into the room, and then they just left. And it's incredible. Very few 19th century schools of thought attract this kind of interest today, and I think it's there was a time in which Marxism was the 19th century school of thought that attracted a lot of people. I don't think it has that same kind of appeal today. I think the Austrian school is doing a lot better. And I think it is because of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is and that was the topic of my talk yesterday in the conference, Bitcoin is a living refutation of a lot of the main ideas in mainstream economics and an advertisement for a lot of the ideas of Austrian economics. So particularly Austrians don't think that money is a creation of the state. Here we have a money that's not a creation of the state. Austrians don't think that the money supply needs to increase. And here we have a perfectly functioning monetary system where the money supply is not increasing.
Saif, last couple minutes, I want to ask you this because you did mention Marxism. Does fiat enable socialism?
Absolutely. I think it's not a coincidence that the century of socialism was the century of fiat, and that is a theme, an important theme in my Gold Standard book. I'm not going to ruin it. I'm not going to give you spoilers, but, well, maybe I will. But essentially, in that alternative century, socialism and leftism are nowhere to be seen effectively. Because if you look at the history of socialism, I mean, it exploded and mushroomed all over the world right after World War I. And that's no coincidence. Before World War I, very few people had ever heard of Karl Marx. And very few people in places like Russia or China had heard about him. And this insane idea that these are grassroots movements is completely ridiculous. It wasn't as if the Russian farmers were reading Karl Marx and realized, all right, and that's it, we figured it out. That's how we fix our lives. It was always an idea that was top down. It was always imposed and financed from the top. And, I get in particular into the history of the Bolsheviks in Russia. And the Bolsheviks were financed by German and American bankers who wanted to bring down the Tsarist regime. And every socialist movement that has come into power in the 20th century, maybe every is a strong word, but I'm pretty sure that is the case, has always had significant funding from foreign sources. It was never an organic movement. You never had this mass movement of a majority of the population reading Karl Marx and then arriving at the conclusion that we need to destroy private property in order to make our country better. It was always people who lusted for power and people who had a lot of money and power and wanted to reinforce their position in society, who used these criminal ideas to undermine the fundamentals of a society and fundamentals of a social working order, undermine the family, undermine religion, undermine monarchy, and undermine capitalism. And if you undermine all of those things, you essentially take away what creates all the basis of human civilization. You return humans to a state of barbarism, and you make them essentially powerless, helpless slaves without capital, without religion, without monarchy, without family. Without these institutions, we go back to being monkeys in the jungles, stinging our feces at each other. And that is essentially what socialism leads to. And that is, I think, it's as you said, it's heavily intertwined with fiat because, first of all, the creation of a central bank and the destruction of the gold standard is the only way that you can implement those ideas. You need to pay a lot of people to wear the jackboots and go knocking people's doors, confiscate their property, take their gold, shoot them if they resist. That's very expensive, and you can't do that on a gold standard. So you've never had a socialist dictatorship that ran a gold standard, as far as I can tell. You have to have it with fiat money. And it's also the reason, I believe, why universities in general are always heavily promoting leftist ideas. Not all and not at all times, but to a very large degree, a vast majority.
Yeah.
The 20th century is just always, across all disciplines in the social sciences, you always see this heavy emphasis on Marxist ideas and leftist and progressive ideas and all these different flavors of the same shit, essentially. And the reason for that is that these ideas help people to help people in power. The people in power like those ideas.
Yep.
And it works perfectly because it is packaged in the rhetoric of helping the poor, helping the downtrodden, helping the farmers and the workers and so on. But all that it does is it destroys those people's lives to the benefits of the people who come to power.
Absolutely.
And the people who have the resources. And so that's why fiat is so popular with socialists, and that's why socialism is so popular with fiaters.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the fifth tenet of the Communist Manifesto is the necessity for the centralization of credit. Saifedean, last question. 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, how do you want to be remembered? What do you want your legacy to be?
Difficult question. I hadn't thought about that one before. I guess somebody who helped people get on Bitcoin, and hopefully people will think that I may have brought about the death of fiat.
Hell yeah.
Helped bring it about, draw it a day earlier, contribute that, then I'd be very happy.
Saifedean Ammous.
Thank you.
Guys, go check out his new book. It's going to be out by the time you guys see this episode. Saifedean, appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool.
Cheers.